by the billion and handled with the care and attention of fine wine. After water, it's the most popular drink on the planet. Quenching the world's thirst for it has raised and wrecked empires. It's a drink of the ancient past and the trendy future. Now, tea on Modern Marvels. Tea. It's a delicate leaf renowned for its ability to stimulate and soothe. And yet this little leaf has played a stunningly significant role in the history of the planet, sparking revolution, precipitating war, and drastically reshaping landscapes across the globe. The human thirst for tea is phenomenal. We drink around 1.5 trillion cups of tea a year, and it remains to this day a mystery drink, full of paradoxical qualities that are the essence of its appeal.
If you're cold, tea will warm you. If you're warm, tea will cool you. If you're excited, it will soothe you. If you're lethargic, it will stimulate you.
The history of tea and the taste of tea and the vast amount of different types of teas and different manufacturing styles and flavors, aromas, textures, colors, characteristics of tea are such that it speaks to us somehow. And once you're exposed to it, you want to learn more, you want to taste more, you want to experience more.
Tea is a major cash crop in dozens of countries around the world, especially in Indonesia, China, India, Kenya, and Argentina. But if you want to find it in North America, you have to come here, to the Charleston Tea Plantation on Wadmalaw Island, South Carolina. This 127-acre tea farm includes a nursery for developing new bushes and an on-site factory that converts freshly picked tea leaf into black tea that is sold throughout the South under the American Classic label. South Carolina and Hawaii are the only places in the U.S. that have the kind of semi-tropical, high rainfall climate needed for growing tea.
What tea enjoys is high temperature and high humidity, and Charleston certainly has that during the summer. So really the tea thrives very well in this location.
The Charleston Tea Plantation has a long and noble history. Tea bushes can live hundreds of years, and the thousands of bushes here are all seeded and cloned from Chinese plants that were imported to Charleston over 200 years ago.
These plants date back to the first tea plants brought to America back in 1799 by a French botanist by the name of André Mouchot, who brought these plants from the Far East.
The original bushes were planted about an hour's drive from here, just outside of Charleston. They produced commercial tea until that plantation went out of business in 1915. The Lipton Tea Company bought the bushes, which it continued to grow on their own, and replanted cuttings here in 1960 as part of a research and development farm. When Lipton decided to shut the farm down in 1987, the Bigelow Tea Company stepped in.
This is a gem. This is a one-of-a-kind thing, and it was just impossible in our minds to see this disappear.
The Charleston plantation provides just a fraction of the tea consumed in the U.S. Americans drink 50 billion servings of tea a year, which sounds like a lot, but is itself just a fraction of what the rest of the world drinks. Tea is only the 6th most popular drink in the U.S., after water, coffee, soft drinks, alcohol, and bottled water. As the number 2 drink worldwide, tea is harvested in gargantuan quantities.
6 billion pounds of tea are produced every year, and it takes 5 pounds of tea, raw leaf tea, to make 1 pound of finished tea. That means 30 billion pounds of tea have to be virtually hand-picked throughout the world.
Commercial tea is usually farmed on vast plantations, like this one owned by Unilever in Kenya, that stretches over 27,000 acres, employs 24,000 people, and has numerous factories on site. It's also cultivated on thousands of smaller family farms, especially in China, where tea farming began millennia ago. and where tea processing as well as farming is still frequently done by hand. There are three major types of tea: black, green, and oolong. But few outside the tea business realize that all three types come from the same plant, Camellia sinensis, which is the only tea plant in the world and is indigenous to China, India, and Thailand. Like wine, there are an estimated 1,500 varietals of tea, with endless varying qualities based on soil and climate. And some are more suited to make one kind of tea over another. But the real differences between black, green, and oolong are created after the leaf has been picked. At the Charleston plantation, we're going to turn about 5,000 pounds of freshly picked Camellia sinensis into black tea. The first step in making any kind of tea is called withering. The leaves are placed on a withering bed, where they lie for 18 hours. Freshly plucked tea is 80% moisture, and that percentage has to come down to exactly 68%.
If the moisture were too low, it would not make a fine quality tea because the enzymes have overbuilt inside the leaf. If they're not withered enough, they haven't built to the sufficient amount to give you that full-bodied flavor when you drink a cup of hot tea or iced tea.
Giant fans accelerate the drying process and make sure the leaves wither equally. The fans alternately blow and suck air for an hour at a time through hundreds of holes in the withering bed. Without the fans, the leaves in the middle would turn red and spoil. Traditional tea manufacturing in places like China doesn't require fans because it involves much smaller amounts of tea. After withering, the leaf at Charleston is conveyed to a shredding machine called a rotovane, where the tea will be ripped into pieces small enough to fit into a tea bag. But it's not just a question of size. Shredding is crucial because it tears open the cell walls of the leaf, which allows the tea to oxidize. There are many ways to break open the cell walls, including a number of traditional hand-rolling methods still popular in China. The rotovane and other mechanical devices are widely used when working with large amounts of leaf.
Inside this rotovane, stationary fingers that we call veins and rotors that go around. And what it's doing is pressing the tea against these veins to rupture that cell wall and expose the tea juices. We want every cell wall broken. We want those juices exposed to the air. These tea juices are what is going to create the oxidation in the leaf to turn it from green leaves into black tea.
The shredded leaves come out of the rotovane and onto the oxidation bed. Oxidation is the defining phase in the process of making black or oolong tea.
You can see it's a very rich green color. This tea is then going to turn from green to a sort of coppery orange color. This is where the miracle of tea takes place. This is where all the flavor is built. This is where most of the quality comes from.
Oxidation is the key to making black, oolong, or green tea. If the tea maker cuts the oxidation time in half, he'd have oolong, a lighter tea that is served in most Chinese restaurants. If he didn't allow any oxidation at all, he'd end up with green tea, the most popular form of tea in Japan, and familiar to anyone who's ever gone to a sushi bar. Oxidation is stopped by steaming the fresh leaves as soon as they've been harvested, as these tea makers from China are doing. Heat neutralizes the enzyme that allows the tea to oxidize and change color. After steaming, green tea goes through the same process of withering, shredding, and drying as black and oolong tea. But today at Charleston, we're making black tea. After exactly 50 minutes, these leaves will produce the kind of light, bright tea that's favored in the U.S.
This is the oxidation that we're looking for. This sort of coppery, orangey color inside the leaf that then goes into the dryer where we're going to take that 68% moisture and reduce it down to just 2%.
Leaves are dried to exactly 2% moisture content because anything more would allow the tea to mold later on. The harvested leaf has now been reduced to 20% of its original size and weight. That's how 5 pounds of tea from the field make a single pound of tea. That pound now goes through a series of shaker sieves to remove impurities. A final sieve uses static electricity to pull out tiny bits of fiber. In most countries, these pieces are painstakingly plucked by hand.
These plastic rollers are pressed against felt, and underneath that creates a static charge. As the black tea goes along the conveyor, all the stem and fiber is sucked up and taken out of the black tea. And this is what we've taken out of the tea to end up with the pure black tea ready to be packed into tea bags.
The process of making tea, which is basically the same around the world, with variations in technology, is simple but exacting.
We have a saying in the tea world that tea is made in the field, the quality is produced in the field, and all you can do in the factory is ruin it or maintain that good quality.
One can only speculate about the quality of the world's very first cup of tea. According to legend, the mythical Chinese emperor Shen Nung discovered tea in 2737 BC, when a couple of leaves fell into his drink. For over 3,000 years, China was the only country in the world that drank tea, and its impact on Chinese culture was enormous.
To us, tea is more than just a beverage. It inspires poetry and painting and the art of just making tea. Chinese people view as making connection with tea, where you're bringing the tea back to life.
From the start, tea was perceived as a remarkably healthy drink. Black tea has about 40 milligrams of caffeine per cup, about half as much as a cup of coffee. Its energizing qualities were duly noted, especially by Buddhist monks, who used tea to stay alert during meditation. In fact, tea remained a Chinese secret until a monk brought some tea seeds to Japan in the 9th century. Building on Chinese traditions, the Japanese developed elaborate tea ceremonies that eventually became known as Cha Do, the way of tea.
Think of tea as Buddhist communion. We are more attuned to what we're paying attention to and less attuned to distraction when we drink tea. So it's a question of wakeful tranquility. And that's exactly what Buddhism is trying to teach.
The Portuguese and the Dutch were the first to bring tea to Europe at the beginning of the 17th century. Tea came late to England, but when it did finally arrive in 1664, it took off. King Charles' Portuguese wife, Catherine, had fallen in love with the exotic Chinese drink in Lisbon, and English aristocrats followed her lead. For a long time, aristocrats were the only ones who could afford tea. It was so heavily taxed, 119% in 1706, that it spawned an enormous black market. By the 1770s, half of the tea in England, an estimated 7 million pounds a year, was illegal. Bootleg tea was heavily adulterated, filled with twigs and leaves, as well as toxic lead chromate, and even sheep's dung, both of which were used as colorizers. Smuggling ended when Prime Minister William Pitt finally slashed taxes in 1784. Legal tea was now affordable to everyone. But before that happened, there was a little matter involving tea in the American colonies. In late November and early December 1773, 3 ships loaded with 342 chests of tea reached Boston Harbor. Bostonians, increasingly touchy about the issue of taxation without representation, refused to let the ships unload. On the evening of December 16th, a group of 30 to 60 colonists disguised as Mohawks broke open the chests and dumped the tea in the harbor. The Boston Tea Party pushed relations between the British Crown and the colonies to the boiling point. In less than 3 years, the Revolutionary War was underway. And tea, which had been highly fashionable and popular throughout the colonies, was suddenly stigmatized.
Tea becomes the ultimate symbol of British tyranny. So it becomes the thing that you despise. You have campaigns in the eastern United States to stop drinking tea in the drawing rooms.
John Adams asked at a tavern, Would it be lawful for a weary traveler to have a cup of tea, provided it has been honestly smuggled? The barmaid said, "No, sir. We have renounced tea under this roof. I'll get you a cup of coffee."
Across the ocean in England, however, demand for tea continued to soar. To meet demand, the British would build plantations in India. Tea plantations that would be modeled on the slave plantations of the American South.
The United States is the only country in the world that prefers its tea iced. 80% of all tea consumed in the U.S. is iced tea.
We now return to tea on Modern Marvels. The role of tea in the making and breaking of empires is inextricably bound up with one of the world's first and most powerful cartels, the British East India Trading Company. The so-called EIC was founded in 1600 by Queen Elizabeth I, who gave it a royal monopoly on all trade with the Far East. The East India Company would become the backbone of the emerging British Empire, and tea, which eventually accounted for fully a third of its profits, would become the backbone of the EIC. By the start of the 19th century, tea was the third most heavily shipped commodity in the world, behind iron ore and cotton. Britain wasn't the only empire fueled by tea. The Chinese had a global monopoly on selling tea, and they weren't interested in selling it for anything but silver. This led to a trade imbalance with England, known as the Silver Sink, which ultimately paved the way for one of the most shameful chapters in British history.
The Opium Wars are about tea. The Opium Wars take place because the British start flooding southern China with Indian opium, selling opium to local people in southern China to pay for the trade imbalance around the tea trade. And that really becomes the base for the two Opium Wars.
In other words, the British went to war with China twice to force the Chinese to buy British opium, so that the British and the East India Trading Company would have silver to pay for their tea.
Their entire enterprise rested on a product that went down the drain in Europe, which was purchased with another which went up in smoke in Asia, and that was opium.
The trade imbalance with China and the fact that it lost its royal monopoly on trade with the Orient in 1834 prompted the East India Company and others to try to cultivate tea outside of China. An indigenous tea plant had been found in the Assam region of India in 1820, and in India, the East India Trading Company could do as it pleased.
They could try you and execute you for violation of their own laws. They had standing armies. They had a navy which was larger than the British Royal Navy. So if you're talking about power, it's a power that's rarely been equaled.
This was their colony. Therefore, they could move into areas and say, this is wasteland, we're going to bring these people into work, and that's it. It's a done deal because it's theirs.
With brutal haste, the British hacked an infrastructure through jungles and forests, created massive plantations, and imported tens of thousands of workers to labor in the fields.
These are systems of production and models of production that have been used in the United States and the Caribbean for 200 years, the slave plantation system. There's a big house, there is hundreds, if not thousands of people who are harnessed to work on these systems with very little, if not any pay. They are brought in from other places to do the work, and they become a trapped, indentured labor force.
Plantation owners even used laws from antebellum slavery in the U.S. to keep its tea workers in line.
If you as a worker tried to escape, you were tracked down like a fugitive. And the Fugitive Slave Law of America, which was used here in slave plantations, was actually applied by the British in tea country.
The disconnect in England about what was happening in India around tea was profound. 70% of the plantation workforce was female, and romanticized images of exotic women with nimble fingers became a staple of tea marketing that continues to this day. Meanwhile, afternoon tea, introduced by the Duchess of Bedford in 1840 to stave off hunger pains, became a national passion tea produced by virtual slaves, many of whom died under savage conditions in the field, now emerged as Britain's quintessential symbol of civility. By 1855, Assam was exporting over 500,000 pounds of tea. The number shot up to 86 million pounds within 30 years, with British imports surpassing those from China in 1888. Along the way, the economy and the landscape of much of the subcontinent was stunningly altered. Vast and uniform new tea fields were engineered to make it as easy as possible to harvest tea.
You see miles and miles and miles of the same height of tea bushes. It looks like a bonsai forest. And the kind of technical attention and focus during labor of keeping those bushes absolutely even is extraordinary. When you're looking at it from afar, it's like an optical illusion. And you think actually that it is like a green carpet, you know, that just stretches out.
The geometric tea fields reflected a new regime of industrialized tea production. Every plantation had its own factory to process the massive harvests of raw leaf. The result was a fundamental shift from the Chinese model of tea manufacturing, which featured small-scale production of many different kinds of tea. To make things as efficient as possible, the British decided to produce primarily black tea. British Empire tea, which would be produced on similar plantations in Ceylon, Kenya, and other colonies, became synonymous with black tea. And black tea outside of Japan and China became synonymous with tea. It would take more than a century for the hundreds of varieties of handcrafted Chinese teas to once again find their way into the West. In the meantime, mass-produced teas would generate new forms and new technologies.